Today we're going to be switching gears quite a bit. We're going to leave our unit on decision making and we're going to start talking about population demography. Now, this is really woven into the rest of the semester because as we talk about different topics and how we can become more sustainable and secure with things like food and energy and develop better ways of doing urban planning. All of this is complicated by the backdrop of population growth. The human population right now is still growing, and we know it will continue to grow even if we were to achieve replacement level fertility tomorrow because of a concept called population momentum, which we'll go into more in the next lecture. So we'll look at in this lecture, where the predictions go as far as where the human population is going to go. But there is no doubt that in your lifetime, you're going to see an addition of probably 2 billion people. So this just makes everything more difficult in terms of achieving a more sustainable world. We're going to take a step back and look at a historical perspective, because what's really remarkable about the human population is that most of this growth has taken place in a relatively short amount of time. So if you think about how long we've been on the planet, there's some disagreement how long anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, have been around. But what we do know is that 200,000 years wouldn't be a bad estimate. I mean, some days it might, maybe someday it will be pushed out to 300,000 years. The time keeps getting pushed back further and further. So if I were to have done this a decade ago, probably would have been talking 150, 275,000 years ago. So now it's 200,000 years. Anatomically modern humans first emerge in Africa, and then they spread out all over the planet and inhabit every niche except for Antarctica, available niche, I should say, and at least on land. And in the beginning of our history, our population grew very slow. If you look at this diagram, you can see that here you have the beginning around 10,000 BC of the agricultural revolution, and you can see things start to grow, but still really at a very slow rate. The plague, really the only event in human history that's ever taken a chunk out of the human population, kind of slows population growth down for a century. And then we get into the late 19th century and things go into hyperdrive. We'll explain a little bit more about how and why that happened. So here's another graph that kind of takes the same perspective, but puts some more historical events alongside for perspective. And you can see how things start to head into hyperdrive really around the year 1600. You don't see very much of it yet, but then around 1900, late 1800s, things start to really rise up dramatically. You can see where the projection is headed, that it's headed towards at least 9 billion people by the time you're middle-aged. I want to review some key events that might not have been obvious from the graph. First, we have approximately 12,000 years ago, the beginning of the agricultural revolution. We'll spend a lecture on that and look at why that probably happened. It didn't happen simultaneous across the world. It happened in a few pockets independently. And from those pockets where agriculture begins, it spreads around until it takes over most of the planet. The only places where people continue to hunt and gather are really the places that were hard to farm. Deserts like the Kalahari deserts, some rainforests, but even in rainforests, agriculturalists and hunter-gatherers existed side by side until even the modern period. There are examples, there are probably still some hunter-gatherers in the Amazon, maybe in Southeast Asia. There certainly were hunter-gatherers in the Amazon up to a decade or two ago. Whether they still remain is a mystery. Now, around 130 BC to 1453, you have we've had earlier stages of globalization before that, but you have globalization accelerating through the Silk Road. It's really an important force in that. The Silk Road unites Eurasia to a trading unit and also to some degree ties in the Arabian Peninsula, parts of the east coast of Africa. Now, what's happening from a population perspective is that agricultural domesticates are being moved back and forth across the Silk Road. So a lot of things that were domesticated in Asia make their way to Europe. Some things that were domesticated in Mesoamerica, not Mesoamerica, I'm sorry, in the Middle East make their way to China. And this allows for wider, not only choices, but things to be grown can produce efficiencies where you can get more food out of a unit of land. It allows for more productive agriculture. Then Silk Road begins to shut down, in part because of tension between China and the Ottoman Empire, and that might be one of the incentives that encourages exploration of the world out of Europe. And then around in the post-1600, so around year 1600, Europe is really laying the foundation for the current global economy. It's connecting all important regions of agricultural domestication, and it allows important crops like corn, wheat, potatoes to move to new geographies. Who could think of Northern Europe today, Ireland, Russia without potatoes, the really most important staple crop in these colder, wet climates? But this is something that only arrives with the Spanish conquest of Peru. As ugly as that was, it allows then a lot of the innovation in terms of food that existed in that region then finds its way to other parts of the planet. Beginning in 1750, we have the start of the Industrial Revolution, and that has major ramifications also for population growth. We'll see that, how that works later on in this lecture. And then around 1850 with cholera in London and John Snow figuring out that cholera is being caused by dirty water, you have the beginnings of the public health infrastructure where governments begin to invest in public health. So these are some of the key dates in terms of really allowing population to take off. You might be asking, where is modern medicine? Modern medicine kicks off really in the 20th century, but by the time things like antibiotics, vaccines are coming around, the population is already booming. Advances in public health infrastructure play a greater role in accelerating population growth than do modern medicine. Remember, and this COVID epidemic has shown this too, the importance of having good public health infrastructure in place. I don't want to go over a concept of looking at growth rates and looking at how long it takes for the population to double. As you can see, at the advent of the agricultural revolution, population on Earth was very small, 6 million people. Today would fit in what's called a mid-sized city. So Chicago, more populous than the entire planet at the time. The annual growth rate was extremely slow, kind of looks like interest on savings rates today. It's going to take a long time. This level of annual growth for the population to double. You can see that amount of time is over 8,000 years. Now, this is something I pulled out with a life expectancy of 20. This is probably, given the date, most of the world were still hunter-gatherers at around 12,000 years ago, but I'm guessing that Massimo is using agriculturalists for this estimate of 20 years. When humans begin to settle down and become agricultural, we'll see in a future lecture that death rates really pick up. All of a sudden, humans are exposed to disease like they've never been exposed to before. I want to give you a formula for the doubling rate, and that's 69.3 divided by the rate. It's a good number to memorize in case you're thinking about how long at a given rate it's going to take you to save enough for retirement, or just a good number. Even for debates, I've heard numbers being thrown around in a rather ignorant way when talking about population growth of, let's say, this region. I've heard people refer to 3% growth as insignificant. If you plug that into your formula, you'll see that that certainly is significant. That's a doubling rate of about 23 years. And if you think about how long it takes to plan infrastructure in this country, you've got no time to lose with a doubling rate that high. So you can see that as agriculture spreads around the globe, the population growth rate picks up. It's still really small. Even at the advent of the Industrial Revolution, it's relatively small. But then things really kick into hyperdrive. In the 20th century, we've got incredible annual growth rates, and we'll see how the demographic transition we're going to go over is very related to the growth rates we're seeing. Death rates are falling first in the high-income countries beginning in the mid-19th century, and really that decline is accelerating in the 20th century. From the mid-20th century onward, we're seeing these declining death rates expand all over the world as modern infrastructure, modern medicine arrives on the scene. And what you see by the 1970s, and actually at one point in the mid-1970s, the growth rate actually crossed the 2% mark. Now, the good news is that population growth today is falling. We're back down to about 1.1%. Our population today is around 7.5 billion, but with a number that big, even a growth rate of around 1% produces a lot of population growth. And you can see if you go from 1950 to the next interval, you can see how life expectancy is increasing, and that's because the benefits of public health and modern medicine are being extended over the globe. Not to mention also cheap food is slowly spreading around the world. So even very poor people might be malnourished, but they usually don't die of starvation. So here you can see the years to doubling. Our population growth has slowed down, so you can see for the first time in a long time, since probably the 14th century, the doubling time is increasing. Here's another look at recent, another way to picture recent population growth. It's not till around the time of Napoleon that we actually hit 1 billion people on Earth. If you takes more than 100 years to hit 2 billion, and you can see then hitting the 20th century, the amount of time to hit the next billion has been getting shorter and shorter until really the time we're in now where it looks like it's beginning to lengthen out a bit. The next 8 billion to 9 billion will probably take more than 12 years. There's another representation of that. So where is the population going? All we can do is look at models. There's a lot of uncertainty in the models. A lot of things can throw them off, like political instability, breakdown in globalization, some kind of threat to our food security. But in all likelihood, no matter what hits us, we're probably going to make it upwards of 10 billion people. So within an 80% likelihood, population is going to level out between about 9.5, 10 billion to 12 billion people. There's a possibility, the light blue above, where you have a less likelihood, some really dire event in the global economy could keep it from going lower. If things hum along in the global economy, there's more harmonization in terms of globalization, things could go even higher than 12 billion. But in all likelihood, we're looking at population stabilizing at a point between 10 and 11 billion. Things don't go crazy. Now, I want to talk about the demographic transition. This is an important concept for you to know. Some places you'll see it just represented as 4 stages. I like to do the 5-stage representation. So stage 1 refers to most of human history, including agricultural history, when birth rates are high and death rates are high. And this is especially true during most of our agricultural history. Humans had a lot of babies. A lot of them didn't live very long. Overall, though, births succeeded deaths, and the human population grew very slowly. Then, as I mentioned, around the middle of the 19th century, something happens and death rates begin to decline. And what is that something that happened? I've mentioned part of it already. It's improvements in the public health infrastructure. It's the Industrial Revolution. So you might ask how the Industrial Revolution would help to lower death rates by making better living possible is the answer. Things that we take for granted, like glass. Glass was something that only the rich could afford in most of the world, until you've got the Industrial Revolution and the advent of cheap glass. So how does this relate to something like life expectancy? Imagine living in a place where things are boarded up for most of the year, especially true in cold climates, where when things get cold, you don't have glass, you just board things up. Then think about the environment that you have inside that dwelling. There's no ultraviolet light coming in for a lot of the year. There's cooking and heating with poor ventilation. So people are taking in a lot of smoke from fires that's been poorly combusted. That's very bad for your respiratory health. And in this dark, dank environment that people are living in, sometimes often with their animals, so lots of bacteria. And you're probably aware that UV light is not 100% effective, but it's a pretty good way to kill off a lot of pathogens. But now when people are living mostly in the dark, the only reason it's not dark is because of fire. This causes unsanitary conditions. So just something like glass will help improve health. Then you think about how people lived until we had the capacity to build better infrastructure. Uh, Water was precarious. We didn't even know that water full of human feces could make us sick, and we couldn't see the feces if it was in the water. Um, People often, as cities were urbanizing, the bulk of people lived without even a basic latrine. And I'm talking about a hole in the ground where people could defecate. There's a lot of defecation on the streets. With the advent of public health, we really begin to remove a lot of those health insults. And that's what allows, first in places like Great Britain, and then Western Europe, and even into Eastern Europe and the United States, then Japan, um, big reduction in death rates. So this stage 2 is characterized by high birth rates and high death rates. Stage 3 is characterized by the fact that death rates continue to drop. This is where your modern medicine comes in. And at least historically. And in stage 3, birth rates are beginning to fall. And then we get to a stage 4 where birth rates and death rates are both extremely low. And there's this stage 5 where you have very old populations and death rates begin to exceed birth rates. Italy might be today, you could call it a stage 5 country. Now, I want to go back and look at stage 3. Why do birth rates fall in stage 3? You'll notice that they remain high in stage 2, even when death rates are dropping. Part of what's happening with death rates dropping is not only that your people that used to live till the age of 30 are now living to 50 or 60, but more and more children who used to die before the age of 5 are living now. One of the big incentives to have lots of children historically was labor, help working on the farm. The notion that you needed lots of children because only few were going to survive. It was particularly important to have several boys to make sure one would survive. And the reason why boys were valued more than girls is that girls would often end up marrying, taking care of their husband's parents. Boys typically stay around and they'll end up taking care of you, the parents. And that's true in a large percentage of cultures. Now, you would think, though, that when people see death rates falling, that they would restrain their fertility. This isn't what happens, in part because there's usually a big lag between when something happens and people really begin to incorporate change. That's the notion, again, of cultures being conservative. However, when you get to stage 3, it's not only that desired fertility is falling because people now realize they don't need to have that many kids, but other things are allowing desired fertility to fall. And desired fertility is measured in terms of how many children women want. There are other things that have to happen to allow fertility to fall. And for now, we'll put that into the broad basket that we'll call empowerment of women. Empowerment of women, we'll talk in the next lecture about how that happens, is really the driver behind stage 3. We'll see in future lecture 2, when we talk about the advent of the agricultural revolution, that 12,000 years ago, at the beginning of the agricultural revolution, the relationship between men and women were fairly equal. Agricultural revolution upsets that and puts women in a state of subservience to men culturally, and that becomes coded into law. In the United States, as late as 1908, in a Supreme Court case, Tinker v. Caldwell, the Supreme Court ruled that women were the property of men. This involved a case of adultery, where the Supreme Court ruled with the man who said that his wife who had committed adultery had violated his property rights. So agriculture, and we'll explore that in our lecture on the agricultural revolution, puts women in a very bad place. And it's not really until the 20th century, so it takes women 12,000 years to begin to recover and move into a position of greater equality, similar to what it was for most of human history. The agricultural revolution, to best of what we know about hunter-gatherers, agricultural revolution, that 12,000 year period, represents an aberration in the relationship between men and women. And we'll see how that was able to happen. So next lecture, we'll talk more about how to empower women, but keep in mind, without the empowerment of women, stage 3 just doesn't happen to the same degree. Now, I want you to look at the space in between the green line and the turquoise line, the birth rate line and the death rate line. The space in between those two lines represents massive population growth. When a society is going through stage 2 and stage 3 of the demographic transition, its population is exploding. Now, Europe was the first part of the world to go through the demographic transition. When Europe went through the demographic transition, 3 things happened, and to an extent that happened in other societies that went through the demographic transition earlier than the current period. So Europe was able to get rid of a lot of its extra population. There are 3 things. You can have international migration, you can have rural to rural migration, and you can have rural to urban migration. Europe in the 19th century does not have a lot of areas to colonize. Internally, there can't be a lot of rural to rural migration. So what you see out of Europe is an incredible migration to other parts of the world. For Europe, migration makes it a lot easier to get through the demographic transition. Surplus rural population is not literally shipped abroad. Most people voluntarily leave to seek opportunity elsewhere, but that really helps alleviate a lot of the pressure of this rapid population growth. In the United States, rural to rural migration was possible because we had a large chunk of land of kept absorbing land to our west, and that kept opening areas for population to move into. In today's world, it's tricky. The possibilities for international migration are closing down. It's becoming much harder to move from one country to another. Countries like Western Europe, or the European Union, I should say, the United States, are becoming more and more hostile towards accepting lots of immigrants. So when you think about countries that have gone through the demographic transition recently or are still going through the demographic transition, their options are a lot more limited. International migration, I mean, people still try, but it's becoming more difficult and often ends in heartbreaking results. You have limited options for rural to rural migration. The exceptions are places that have marginal agricultural land, i.e. rainforests, parts of Africa, in Southeast Asia, in South America, little pieces of Central America. People are moving into rainforest and trying to create agricultural spaces there. But the parts of the world that have gone through the demographic transition recently are not as blessed with the same opportunities that countries had that went through the demographic transition earlier. And of course, that pushing out of population from Europe to other parts of the world came at the expense of others. So that needs to be noted too, that there were slaughter of native people, and also the so-called Columbian exchange, where biological, whether it's food or bacteria, diseases, things are being moved around the world at an incredible pace. A lot of places that Europeans colonized, they basically used a cocktail of diseases that had developed in Eurasia as a biological weapon to clear natives off the land, even if that was done not intentionally. In some cases, we know it was done intentionally, like giving Native Americans blankets that were infected with smallpox. Okay, want to cover another important fact, that in today's world, a lot of places the population is no longer growing and it's even shrinking. It's in the low-income countries today where most of the world's population growth is occurring. And not only are these low-income countries, but these are often places that have other environmental factors that make current population growth disturbing. Often places with limited fresh water, they're experiencing some of the harshest noticeable effects of climate change already. These are areas, also because they're poor, have often not very good modes of governance that are least able, least resilient to deal with the growing population. So you can see where things are growing by region. Europe is very flat, North America is flattening, Latin America is kind of flattening. It's big growth is really happening in Africa and parts of Asia. And again, want to mention, just give you an example of how population just makes everything else harder. The Sahel region is the area that's directly south of the Sahara Desert. It faces a lot of crises at the moment. One is a food crisis. The food crisis is being made tougher by desertification. This is due in part to poor land use practices, people trying to grow too much food using poor techniques. It's due to climate change, rainfall changing. A very interesting thing to do is to look at a map of Lake Chad in the 1950s and look at a map of Lake Chad today. The lake is literally disappearing. A lot of this is just due to reduced rainfall. So this is an area of the world where there's a lot of political instability, a lot of poverty, has some of the fastest growing population rates in the world, and on top of it all, desertification. So this area you could call is a ticking time bomb, and you can see how the population growth is really exploding in this region. Given the low levels of economic development, given the environmental stressors, it's really hard to imagine right now a good future for this region. It's a place that the global community should invest resources in. The longer we wait, the bigger this potential bomb becomes when it eventually explodes. The Middle East is another one of the areas where population has been growing really fast, especially on the Arabian Peninsula. One of the things that characterizes this part of the world is extreme aridness, very little amount of water to go around per capita. The richer countries like Saudi Arabia, Israel are investing heavily in desalination. but some of the more landlocked populations are really struggling to get enough water to survive day to day. There's very good evidence that the Syrian civil war was touched off by a lack of water, a drought. This caused farmers to have to give up their land. They moved into urban areas. There was no assistance from an unempathetic government. So this was like putting matches to gasoline. The place finally did explode, and Syria is still a place where the old regime has survived, but it's a very damaged country where there's still large pockets of conflict in the country. I mentioned water. You can see areas that are some of the most water insecure places on the planet also correspond to some of the fastest growing regions from a population perspective. Right. I'd like to have you think about this. There is a relationship between fertility rates and gender inequality. You can see this correlation on this graph here. What you see is that as gender inequality increases is greater, the number of children women have goes up. So the bigger the power imbalance between men and women, the higher the rate of reproduction. I want you to think about this, and we're going to talk about why this might be true. Also, before next class, I'd like you to watch this brief video. It's about 12-15 minutes. It's called Banking on the Poor. It's going to be an important part of our discussion during our next in-class portion. Here are some other questions for you to think about before class, because these are things we will also be discussing. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to talking about these issues in our next class.